It's a really lucky team to be on. There's a couple other individuals in the room that are also on that team, and there's a great group of engineers that are working behind us. And so what I would like to talk through in the next 50 minutes or so is what's been released recently that you're going to want to know about, and then in some cases I will make forward-looking statements on the tools, so roadmap type stuff. When I say the term forward-looking statement, this is a very specific term. What that means is I'm going to say, hey, we're going to bring something, we're planning on this. It does mean that you can't be like, I'm only going to buy SQL if you deliver this in the future. Those are not those kinds of statements. It is not a contractually binding thing. Just keep that in mind. I'm doing everything I can to be as transparent as I can, but it is not a contractually bound thing. It's just a forward-looking statement. I will save time at the end for questions. So I'm going to get through this, and there's going to be time before the 50 minutes is up. So I will ask that you hold those questions, write them down if you need to remember them. I have 2 slides that are really good to get pictures of with your phone. The first one is the feedback code and link. I'll show this again at the end. You'll probably also get an email reminder because you scanned into the room. The one you won't get a reminder about is this one. There's a lot going on this slide. What it is it is the feedback link for all of the tools for SQL. And in some of them, the first one, SSMS, you may have memorized, hopefully, that you can send feedback through that at aka.ms/SQL feedback. But a lot of the other tools have GitHub repositories where the engineers themselves are out there interacting directly with people that use those tools. So there's a lot of good opportunities to share feedback. We truly do want it. That is what being a PM is rooted in, is being able to advocate for what users want and or need to do their jobs well and to get the most out of SQL. I'll show it again at the end, so if you discover that the picture you took is blurry, don't worry. The thing that I wanted to set the stage with a little bit about SQL Tools is that it's not just one thing that gets shipped to you, SSMS, for example. Behind the scenes, there's a SQL driver, just like you would use if you're building an other application on top of SQL, so in this case, SQL client. And then there are libraries that help SSMS do what it needs to do. SMO, SQL Management Objects. The engineer for SMO is really going to appreciate that. The SMO package helps SSMS manage the backup operations and other kind of database, kind of like the name suggests for SMO, SQL Management Objects, do the management tasks. And then on the DAC effects side, that's more for deployments and portability if you want to import or export a database. Why this kind of thing is important is this is how we help drive consistency. Another tool, these are just examples, Azure Data Studio, then brings those same libraries up in the same way. This is why sometimes when we ask about how do we reproduce this, does it reproduce somewhere else, we're trying to narrow things down as quickly as we can. That also means that when there are changes in one of these libraries or in the driver, we're going to end up delivering it to all the tools. One of those changes has been not minor. And that's been a change to SQL Client over the last 2 years to be secure by default. Or you might know it as, my connections are no longer working. In SQL Client 4, so we were on 3 in most of the tools previously. In SQL Client 4, the encryption default was changed from false to true, secure by default. So if you weren't connecting with encryption before and you weren't ready to connect with encryption at all, then your connections would start failing. You would have to manually set that back. Then after that, in SQL Client 5, the options were added for support for the TDS 8 protocol, the version 8 of that protocol, which means that TLS 1.3, which is more efficient for negotiating authentication, can be used. Faster, better performance. And so that gives, instead of true-false for encryption, 3 things: optional, mandatory, and strict. The true-false translation is there. We've been moving all of the tools from 3 to 5. So at different times, you might notice slightly different connection dialogues. What I will give a generic blanket advisory to consider for your environment is go ahead and connect with encryption. At least over the wire, things will be connecting with encryption. However, depending on your environment, so if you have a SQL Server box in a closet or a data center or a closet that you call a data center, it may not have a fancy certificate, a very well-known authority trusted certificate. So you're going to need to trust the server certificate. It's just a self-signed one that comes automatically. You can trust that, so you still connect with encryption. It's just not the best encryption. Good news is if you're using managed instance or Azure SQL database, you won't need to worry about that at all. This is an overall attempt by the SQL team to help you be secure by default, and we'll do our best to communicate how these changes impact all of the tools. Which tools am I going to talk about today? We have a large portfolio of tools. Your database comes with a bunch of tools for it. It's designed to make developing and administering SQL easier and, frankly, more flexible to what you need to do with it. The ones I'm going to talk about today are in the red boxes. So SSMS, Azure Data Studio, VS Code, Visual Studio. Those are our kind of big four graphical interfaces. And then I've got some libraries and CLIs that I also want to call out, other kind of evolution in that space. So things you use for automation or maybe programming smaller applications. I'll start with the one no one's heard of. So SSMS. SSMS 20 GA'd earlier this week. Aaron was kind enough to hop on a plane and GA something at the same time on March 19th. Very impressive. This did include that change that I just talked about a moment ago to SQL client, that the encryption now, it defaults to being enabled. So we have the TDS 8 option for SQL Server 2022 that you will need SSMS 20 if you want to force strict encryption. And that means that the connection dialog has changed. Your cheese has been moved. It's an expression. There are several good blog posts on this. So I was kind of being humorous, but frankly, you may have connections that you create new connections and they will fail suddenly when you won't expect it because of those encryption by default changes. Aaron's blog posts will be very helpful for you in navigating that in SSMS. Overall, you will be able to import settings from SSMS 19 and everything you've done in the past to make sure you stay on the most recent. Before I touch back on other big changes from the last releases of SSMS 19, I'm going to look forward, because who doesn't love excitement this early in the morning? What about SSMS 21's roadmap? What are we going to do there? This is where we're looking to move to the Visual Studio 2022 shell. SSMS is built on top of that core layer of Visual Studio, the shell, and this migration, while very much non-trivial, will bring SSMS to 64-bit. So that gives you a larger memory space for working with as many query editors as your heart desires. The connection dialog will also have additional changes or an overhaul to it, so that the way you save connections can be drastically improved. The connection properties will continue to move more frequently used ones to the front dialog. And then the save password functionality, I know, has been quite finicky. Overhauling the connection dialog is giving us the opportunity to really dig down and root out the last of the bugs that are causing problems there. And the installer. Who loves downloading 500 megs every time you update SSMS? No one. I am shocked. The installation and update process is something that can be improved and is something we're planning on the SSMS 21 roadmap. Some truly foundational pieces of SSMS are being updated as a part of this roadmap. SSMS needs that investment and it absolutely deserves it, so we're very excited on my updates to bring that forward. However, that's not to say, I knew I was forgetting something. I always forget AI, Aaron. How do I work here? Copilot and SSMS. That is on the roadmap as well. We do want to not just copy-paste Copilot from somewhere else. We do want to make sure that the Copilot that lands in SSMS is truly impactful to the things that are difficult or tricky or slow you down. So if you do have feedback specific to how you would like to use Copilot in your database context, the SSMS Copilot feedback link is much, much appreciated. There was more in depth on what happened in SSMS 20, as well as what's to come in SSMS in yesterday's session. I know most of us don't have time machines, so when the recordings come out, that will be an interesting one, should you be quite intrigued. Back in SSMS 19, which just had its last releases at the end of last year, the startup time for SSMS continually improves, so always make sure you're moving to the latest. The Azure authentication options, we added service principal, managed identity, and then just the blanket default option. So if you're in a very, now it's Entra, heavy authentication environment, you'll want SSMS. In terms of the troubleshooting and tuning capabilities within SSMS, there were two really nice kind of efficiency and usability improvements. The first one was being able to watch live data for extended events. This is applicable to Azure SQL Database and Azure SQL Managed Instance. And then the X-Event Profiler was also enabled for Azure SQL Database. There's a bunch of other stuff that has been added across the 19 releases in the release notes, but those are two pretty foundational changes that I wanted to make sure everyone knew about. All right, SSMS is the big one. Hang tight. I promise everything else is also really important before we get to questions. If you have questions, again, just jot them down so you don't forget. Azure Data Studio is the lighter weight, more developer-focused client tool. However, that doesn't mean that it locks you out of every administrative task. The Object Explorer got some improvements in terms of filtering. So if you have 1,000 tables and you want to be able to search and find, great, you have filtering. There is what I call light admin dialogues that have been added into Azure Data Studio. So perhaps you prefer to be in a lighter weight environment for doing a lot of particular activities like writing T-SQL scripts, and then you find you need a dialogue for something related to managing server roles. Those non-wizard but simple dialogues have been added to the last 2 releases of Azure Data Studio. For those who are in depth into source control, the diff editor has been improved. So if you're looking to check in code and you've just moved some lines around, it'll actually detect this line has been moved. You don't need to mark it as a conflict. For Azure Data Studio, if you are someone who prefers to be on the bleeding edge of things, there is an insider build that'll get you almost daily to weekly type updates. Don't get the insider build if you don't want daily to weekly updates. The light admin dialogues that I mentioned just a moment ago, this is kind of the flavor of them. They're not dramatic overhauls of what you would have been familiar with in SSMS. They're going to be very similarly structured. The options are going to be pretty consistent. So it's designed to be familiar enough that it's still comfortable and you can use it if you're familiar with it from SSMS, but at the same time, simplified just enough that if you're not familiar with this functionality, maybe you have someone that's more junior on your team or someone that you're teaching up, this may be a nice environment for them to kind of get to know some of these database options. With the DAC and Friends family, this DAC is a library, and there are a number of tools and then CLIs, so graphical tools and CLIs that pick up DAC, and I have to kind of group them together. Otherwise, the changes themselves don't make a ton of sense. The first one everyone knows is Visual Studio. They had a great Visual Studio 2022 release, so that was 2 years ago, and they offered a lot of performance improvements, so we were glad that SQL projects are alive and well in Visual Studio. In addition to SQL projects coming to Visual Studio 2022, there are 3 core extensions around SQL Server: analysis services, reporting services, and integration services. Those are all GA. Some of them landed after Visual Studio 2022 released, but it's been nice to see all of them GA. The Visual Studio releases come in point release, so 17.8, 17.9, 17.10. And after every individual release GAs, they do a number of previews. So you can get on the preview channel for Visual Studio, and they kind of do generally previews 1 through 6-ish for each release. Right now, they're on 17.10 previews. We GA'd 17.9 a couple 4 weeks ago, give or take. Back in November, was the Visual Studio release that moved to SQL Client 5, so that secure by default. And then serverless SQL pools got their SQL project support in Visual Studio, so if you're using Azure Synapse Analytics. In 17.9, there's an additional database setting for DW compat level. This is slightly different from your database compatibility level. In the data warehouse offerings, they have a distinct compatibility level to govern some syntax differences. So if you're working with someone that's working on an analytics project and they're having trouble using some syntax that's in preview, this is something to look into. And then in 17.10 previews, right now the SSDT support for ARM64 has been added. So Visual Studio ships an ARM64 version, and that's there. As far as the roadmap for SSDT, there's two things. The first one is Fabric Data Warehouse, recently GA'd last November, and we're bringing that target platform into SQL projects. The second one is support for SDK-style SQL projects. If you've worked with SQL projects and you've looked at the project file, you might have noticed that it is quite long. There's a line for every file in the project, and you end up with merge conflicts. SDK-style SQL projects gets you away from that, and it requires an SDK library. That library is in preview right now. It's called microsoft.build.sql. Your project file gets a lot shorter, so you don't have those merge conflicts. But then you get some more modern programming paradigms when it comes to SQL project development. So you can do package references for DAC packs, which means a DAC pack can get packed up into a new package and put on a feed for your company. You can break apart your ginormous database into different packages to more easily develop it. And the build itself is cross-platform. So if you have a team, the DevOps team that's got all Linux runners, then you can use those pipelines. Right now, this is available from the command line, Azure Data Studio, and VS Code in preview. And then, like I mentioned before, we're working on the SSDT offering for this so that we can bring it across all of the tools. The SDK-style SQL projects in Azure Data Studio and VS Code are in preview, but you do have, as I show in the dialog there, the ability to use NuGet package references for your database components. So maybe if you have a multi-database application, so you have several databases on an instance that you need to reference, you can package up the ones that are more stable into these packages and then reference those. So let's say you have it's either a warehouse or a metadata store database, and then you have other application databases. You can kind of compartmentalize your application in that way. The Synapse Serverless and Fabric DW target platforms have been added into VS Code and Azure Data Studio, and then the ability to save publish profiles, which is already in Visual Studio, has been added. Getting down more into the CLI side of DAC effects is SQL Package. I'm going to introduce SQL Package just a moment because I know with CLIs, if we don't use them frequently, we kind of forget what they do before I tell you what's been added new to it. For SQL Package, you're going to have your machine there on the bottom, and then whatever SQL database you use. I know the icon is technically for Azure SQL Database, but SQL Server 2016, Azure SQL Managed Instance, all of them. With SQL Package, you can do publish and extract of DAC packs. So let's say your database objects you develop over time, and instead of doing that artisanal handcrafting of scripts to make those changes, you package what you would like for your create statements, and SQL Package will figure out this is how you apply those changes and apply them for you. In addition to database deployments, SQL Package also handles database portability. This is a core promise of the platform as a service, Azure promises, where you can bring your database to Azure SQL Database, and you don't have access to the backup files, the MDF file. It's a platform as a service, but you do not lose the portability of your database. If you want to take that data out, you can still do that, and that's what SQL Package provides. This is also a potential migration pathway into different platform as a service with the import and export operations. Those of you that are familiar with this also know that this has been around as long as Azure SQL Database has been around. It's been a while. Databases have gotten a little bit bigger. It worked great when databases were 100 gigs regularly. They are not that small anymore. very large. There was this whole trend about big data. It hasn't gone well for backpacks. However, what we are currently in preview with SQL package is, instead of the data all getting crammed in a giant zip file, it is as bad as it sounds, what we do is we put the schema object in the DAC pack. We're all familiar with that concept. But the data itself actually gets written to Parquet files in Azure Blob Storage, which you kind of win twice here, because first off, you're not trying to literally compress all that data into a single file. And then on the other hand, you also don't have to allocate disk space or do network transfer for all of this data. You designate blob storage right next to your database, VM and Azure SQL Database MI, and now your data is only being transferred within a data center instead of out of the data center to your machine. When we test this with multi-terabyte databases. It's been a very cool preview. It is currently in preview for MI and SQL 2022. It does require Polybase to be enabled. I know that there are some of you that are writing down the question, what about Azure SQL Database? Coming soon. If you are extremely eager, find me or send me an email, but coming very soon. Obviously, the great use case will be in Azure SQL Database. It is a multi-fold kind of speed increase, both going in and going out. In terms of the other operations and improvements to SQL package, the publish property, one of the things that makes people very nervous is that it does calculate what it needs to do to make those changes. If I need to alter a table to add a column, it's going to figure that out. Which maybe if your developer does something that requires a table to be recreated by, copying the data out and copying the data in, it's not particularly effective deployment. It can take a while. There's an option now where you can block table recreation. SQL package will calculate the deployment plan. If it sees a table recreation, it'll exit out and give you the warning that I found a table recreation and I've stopped for you. The other new addition to SQL package from the last year, worth knowing about for sure, is the extract target capability. So when you run a SQL package extract, the default is that it gives you a DAC pack, also a zip file. It's nicely packaged, it's very portable, great, but maybe you just want to know, literally, what are the objects? I don't want to have to open up this DAC pack, read the XML. That's not fun for anyone. The extract target property will write out to SQL files themselves directly, the objects of the database, which can be very nice. SQL package is available as a .NET tool, so you can just install it quick from the terminal, and then it's available to execute from either automation or ad hoc, again, at your terminal there. And it is cross-platform, so if you have those kind of Linux-type DevOps environments or pipelines, you can use it, but it also runs super fantastic on Windows. It's another .NET application. Speaking of DevOps environments, some of you may be thinking about, hey, do I want to use Azure DevOps? Do I want to use GitHub? We do have great support for SQL package for portability and deployments in both. The GitHub SQL action does have some cool functionality when it comes to Azure SQL Database. If you have Azure SQL Database and it's protected by firewall rules, great idea. However, when you try to run deployments, they get blocked by the firewall rules, and you don't really want to just allow things forever. The GitHub SQL action can be set up such that it creates a just-in-time firewall rule for itself, runs its execution, and then removes that firewall rule. So you can kind of use this as a piece of making sure that your DevOps environments are as secure as possible. All right, we are on track for questions at the end, I promise. That's the good news. One programmability tool for folks that have an Azure estate, or especially that are working with SQL, are Azure Functions. Azure Functions are components of code. This is the platform as a service for developers where they get to write their C# code or their Python code, ship it out to Azure Functions, and that service manages the operating system, the patch upgrades, really everything around that segment of code it gets triggered by an event and it spits out whatever it needs to. So this can be a very lightweight way to build web application APIs, but this can also be a really lightweight way to orchestrate things that you might typically do through like SQL agent. For SQL, we do have bindings for Azure functions now. The name of these suggests that they work with Azure SQL, which is technically correct, but thankfully it works with SQL Server 2016 and up because of OpenJSON syntax, MI, and SQLDB. Technically speaking, your SQL Server database doesn't even need to be in Azure as long as it has connectivity. You might be sitting there thinking, I'm not really much of a developer, I can write a few things. The language spread of Azure functions is fantastic. PowerShell, if you've got somebody on your team that knows a little bit of JavaScript, all of those are compatible with the bindings for SQL and Azure functions. These went GA over the period of about the last 9 months. So input binding and output binding were earlier last year. The input binding means that your function runs a query, you give it the query, and it brings the results of that into the function so you can do something with it. Maybe you want to pass it on to another database as a lightweight ETL, or maybe you want to send it off as an email, just some random ideas. An output binding is where information from the function is getting output into a table. I know those of us that are very database-centric are like, wait a minute, I want to input things to my database. You have to look at things from the function side. You're outputting from the function into a table. So if you want to be logging events to a table, output bindings are a really light way to do this. And when I'm saying lightweight, just to set the standard, like I'm talking about 10 lines of code. We are all capable of that. This last one I held off on for a moment because I know I put the word trigger on there and some of you are like, oh no, I was liking him. This is not a T-SQL trigger. This is a part of the library that leverages change tracking to respond to changes that it pulls out of a queue on the database. So the overhead on the database, compute-wise, is fairly lightweight. Size-wise depends on your workload, but it is not a T-SQL trigger. I know that we would still love to architect all of these things out of our applications, but we don't all have the luxury of starting from scratch. So sometimes it's nice to just be able to work with what you have. In that case, if you have change tracking or the opportunity to enable change tracking, you can respond to data changes and start your Azure function. These are nice things to have in your back pocket when you get to that like business scenario where they're like, hey, how can we do this? You're like, well, we have SQL Server 2019. I love it. I have Azure functions. We all know and love SQL CMD, probably, once you get it working. So in that vein, SQL CMD is based on ODBC. ODBC is a fantastic, very stable driver, but we wanted a little bit more flexibility when it comes to having a CLI that we can update more quickly for those that need to adopt new features or maybe want to use it in more versatile environments as a single executable type tool. And that's where Go SQL CMD came into play. Why did we call it Go SQL CMD? Because it's based out of the Go programming language, which might not mean anything to you except for that it is just going to compile to a single executable. So it's very portable, and you can get it into whatever environment you need, as well as we know from the Microsoft standard of things that the code security of it is very good, and so we have fewer concerns about security vulnerabilities. As we stabilize it, we're less concerned about some of the security vulnerabilities you see in a language like C++. So if you're wondering, all right, well, now I'm going to have to rewrite all my scripts, the good news is that there is nearly 100% compatibility with SQL CMD. The things that have been removed or not implemented are very few and far between, and mostly around things like don't put your password in plain text in the commands kind of thing. But you can also get it through package managers. So if you want to try it out and then remove it, it's a little bit easier. The first thing that we were very quickly able to get out of Go SQL CMD that was a nice advantage came through some of the DevOps environments, being able to use AAD or Entra ID authentication, managed identities, service principals, all of those nice best practices become a lot easier with Go SQL CMD because we're not needing to interplay with the ODBC driver. We did not stop there. One thing that we've heard from folks is we'd like it to be a little bit easier to stand up a container, play around with some things, tear it down, stand up a container, get connected to it, tear it down. You know what's really funny? You guys won't appreciate this, but we have some crossover between the SMO team that had the airplane earlier and the Go SQL CMD team. That's funny. That's funny. They have no other things in this presentation, though. The SQL CMD has, the Go version, has container management built in for development environments. So there's a new command within SQL CMD create MS SQL. There's a few more syntax options after that. But what this will do is pull a container for local development, start it up, and it configures that connection within the SQL CMD tool. It becomes that default connection. You can get the connection string out. You can have it open up client tools with that connection. All of that is pretty cool. What makes it really useful is one of the options for this is a -- using. And what that does is you can point it at a back file, so a database backup, and say, hey, as you're deploying and standing up that container, grab that backup and go ahead and restore it for me. So you get that environment going pretty quickly. It's cool. So that's there's a quick start that walks through that in case you're not as familiar with containers or new to SQL CMD at the Go SQL CMD QS. The Azure portal, you might be like, wait a minute, this is tools. Technically, it's tools and experiences, or you can just accept that the portal is a tool. When you're interacting with Azure SQL Managed Instance or Azure SQL Database on the web, you have those nice portal experiences. They allow you to do some configuration or get to know the product a little more easily before you move into ARM or Bicep or the Python SDK, all of those different ways to manage it, but the portal's kind of that front door. With that said, I wanted to make sure you saw two cool things that have been landing on the front door to Azure. The first one is we added a component to the portal to light up the Azure SQL Managed Instance free offer. You might be thinking, managed instance, it costs a lot of money. How could it be free? There is that 1-year free offer. It is the general purpose for up to 100 databases. And it's a vCore hours setting, so you have basically business hours type free, but this is a great way to get to know managed instance, test it out for workloads. So that's been added to the portal there. Same concept for Azure SQL Database. This one's a little bit different because instead of being a 1-year thing, it is a lifetime subscription concept. And the amount of compute per month is calculated a little bit differently, and it's a 32 gig database, but this is like a free database. This could be your hobby website. This could be the next project that you abandon after a couple of weeks. This could be anything. And that is, again, forever on your subscription for free. The other functionality in the portal that has been added is the Elastic Jobs component. That in itself is not new. I'll be clear about that one. It has been refreshed. When I say refreshed, I mean, hey, it's been in preview for a while, and we want to make sure that it is really good enough to GA. And so we've finished out a bunch of capabilities, which has resulted in refreshing the interface itself. So with Elastic Jobs, making it more backward compatible, as well as then improving the alerting capabilities of it. I've got some screenshots that will help me point out. So it's added a whole bunch of options on the left. So if you've been playing with Elastic Jobs and you've been kind of like, this is really bare bones, check out now that it's been refreshed because you've got better access to scale as well as the identities that are used for Elastic Jobs. You get better visibility to the job agent cost as well. All right, the good news is that I came in 5 minutes under, so we have all kinds of time for you to ask me questions and put me in the hot seat. Before I do that, I have a few things for you. The first one is if you are interested in DP300, there is a 50% off coupon, so I am sharing that with you. And then I have a couple other fun things. Sorry. Cool. And I will definitely be more than happy to get the URL to folks as well. The other cool opportunity right now is that we are investigating the integration between SQL and Fabric. We're very much into how can we make SQL as easy and consistent to use as possible. However, this is something that's a little bit more longer tail, so I don't have anything to be like, this is our roadmap. What I do have is a form that basically takes you through a secret portal to where you would have future engagements with the team as we explore this. So because it's sometime between now and next SQL Bits, and I will sadly not see you likely for another year, if you'd like to keep in touch and you're interested in kind of that space, do fill out that form and someone will be in touch and we can check that out. All right, the reminder of we do want your feedback, and I will take that feedback basically now in the form of questions, as well as I would love, and the team would love to hear from you as you run into issues and you provide us with, this is how it happened, this is what I've tried, or you have an idea of, this has been slowing me down, I'd really like this new feature. We do really want to hear it so we can make things easier. I will go back and forth between these slides here, but I see we've got a hand already, so let's go for questions now. We have 13 minutes.
Great presentation.
Thanks.
Quick question. I know you've got a Apple Mac there, and I suspect it's an ARM-based chip, an M chip. The only thing that's stopping me ditching my Windows laptop is SSMS. I missed the SMS session yesterday, so I don't know what's in the roadmap. But is that something I'm ever going to be able to do, run SSMS on an ARM64 Mac?
So I'm gonna start with kind of like it depends. The question around if you have an ARM Mac especially, and can I run SSMS is a little bit, no, I'm gonna be really direct with you. We started the SSMS session with, this is how you run SSMS on your Mac. Now, SSMS can run on ARM64 Windows. So I'm going to start by not satisfying you at all to mention you could use like UTM, which is a free virtualization application, run a Windows VM, open up SSMS. Frankly, that is good for the exception scenarios, not for day-to-day. Your Mac is fast, your Mac is battery efficient. You don't want to also be running another operating system to take up 4 gigs of RAM or whatever. So it's good for the exception scenarios. What I would then follow that up with is there's a reason why I had a selection of light admin components for Azure Data Studio. We do have cross-platform tooling, and it's not just a, hey, this is a nice idea. Like, that is a commitment that we want people to be able to use SQL with whatever operating system component they have. So my follow-up question, and this can be open to anyone, is what kind of tasks do you find you're not able to do outside of SSMS that you really need to be able to do from whatever machine? Is that a quick answer?
I suppose there's probably a lot of hardcore DB admins who, still love SSMS a lot more than Azure Data Studio. They still bring it across. I don't know. I'm kind of a bit of a software engineer, data engineer, more and more data science, so kind of going a little bit more with the Mac. And, yeah.
Okay.
I've used Azure Data Studio, it's great. And, yeah, with basic, I guess things like some of the failover stuff, functions and things, wizards, those things.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Thank you. I will also expand that that is a huge topic area of interest. It's obviously not one that's going away, nor did I have a really, really simple answer. We would love to talk at length with anyone, so please feel free to stop by the booth and chat with us about it. I wanted to let Aaron chime in here too, who's another PM. So there was in the room, we did a quick kind of like show of hands of who's using a Mac. As the SQL team, we have a couple ways to get input on our products and understand them. One is by having these great conversations and talking with people or the feedback sites. Another one is through telemetry, which kind of shows us current state, not future state. So having these moments where we can find out what platform are you using, or having a, hey, I would like to go in this direction with my estate or with my machine, is really helpful for us. Thank you for remembering to ask that question. Go ahead.
It's interesting you're moving SSMS to Visual Studio 2022 base. Wasn't the legacy Visual Studio base the major blocker for implementing the dark mode? Dare we hope that might change from a no to a maybe at some point in the future?
So the question I also saw coming is the question around, hey, I caught back, 15 minutes ago you mentioned SSMS is moving to the VS 2022 shell. In the past, we've talked about Visual Studio is, SSMS is built on the Visual Studio shell, and the way that that's done is not making it easy to support dark mode. I am here not to make everyone happy, but to be candid with you and not overset expectations. Aaron is giving you a door prize for asking the great question, but yes.
It says, you don't need dark mode when you've got the SQL community.
So the sticker that's being handed out in the room, is a little bit tongue-in-cheek. It's a light bulb, and it says you don't need dark mode when you've got the SQL community. Unfortunately, it is not the version of the shell. It's that SSMS is a work of art. You have the VS shell, which is the query editor and the object explorer. And then you have thousands of wizards and dialogues that are all custom implementations. Now, it makes me physically uncomfortable to say never. However, if you really want theming, you probably want to be mostly using another tool. I also don't want to be flippant that there is accessibility components involved with dark mode and theming to applications. With SSMS, ensuring that it has good accessibility for folks with different visual capabilities means that dark mode needs to be done and really thoroughly considered. So it's not just like we make a sticker about it, but we also do really thorough investigations. And as we go to the VS 2022 shell, every time we do a shell upgrade, we do evaluate it. So it isn't just something where we're like, oh, that question again. It really is. It is a serious thing that we do make sure we have thoroughly investigated. So I'm going to say never, but in really small font. Next question.
I was wondering about the Elastic Job Agent, if the deploy routine for that will also get some improvements.
So the question was around the deployment of the Elastic Job Agent and if that's getting improvements. That is outside of my area of expertise, so I can't call it off the top of head. However, if you grab my email, let me flip to my email slide so y'all can contact me with all the things I can't answer. I will get you the answer. Purple sweater.
Thanks a lot for your talk, Christopher. I love to use Azure Data Studio, and I work with special data, and I have to switch over to SSMS. Is there any move near future that I can maybe use only Azure Data Studio and special data?
So the question was around Azure Data Studio and being able to use spatial data with it. And the two-part answer to is there any hope is yes, but make sure you have gone to the GitHub repo for Azure Data Studio. It is a component that we're aware of that is a gap and have kind of in the queue of issues. but raise your voice there, kind of repeat what you just said to me in the comments. That would be very, very helpful. And then if there are other components where you're like, hey, I'm almost to the point where I'm very satisfied with using Azure Data Studio, would love to hear all about that. But yes, there is hope. Spatial data is something that is, I can't quite say on the roadmap, but it is in the queue. I've got 5 minutes, so we can do a couple more questions. I'll try to be quick. Go ahead. So the question around Go SQL command and is it then compatible back with the original SQL command? The really quick answer is yes, except for -p. So -p was the, now you put your password and clear text in the command line. Not a great idea. We decided that like, we can give you scissors, but then like basically we're saying and run. So we just took the scissors back.
There's one question from the virtual audience. Is there any plan to support connections to SSAS models and or process them?
So the question was around SSAS models, and I'm either out of my depth or they might have meant to mention a specific tool for SSAS support. So that might be a sign that the answer is no, but they are welcome to email me to get a more clear answer. We have 3 minutes. Go ahead. I love that question. So the question was, does Azure Data Studio replace SSMS? And you could kind of, take spinner wheels and put all of the tools in that question. And the most direct answer is no. There are how many different SQL offerings? SQL Server, Azure SQL Database, Azure SQL Managed Instance. You can kind of cross-reference Arc. You get the point. There are tools for different scenarios, different kinds of workloads, different kinds of users. Some of you, we've had a couple examples today where people are like, I put on this hat and I do this job, and then I take off that hat, I close SSMS, and then I put on this hat and I open it. There are those different tools. We're going to do what we can to make sure that you're not jumping between tools constantly. So if we can ever consolidate in a way where everything for everyone comes into a tool from another, that could be a possibility. So kind of in that, like, I physically can't say never would we remove a tool. But that said, if we do that, it's so that everything is there. Like, we don't cut people out of things without really, really severe situations. That is not one of them. SSMS is here to stay. SQL projects have not died. I've heard so many fun rumors. I love coming to these things. Yes, so we have 90 seconds. I can do one other semi-controversial question. Go ahead.
A question regarding the notebook approach in Data Studio. Will that come to the Management Studio?
Notebooks are not on the immediate roadmap for SSMS. However, Erin is sitting right there and is the PM for SSMS, and I am throwing her like right next to the bus right now. She would love to hear about what you do with notebooks and how it would be helpful to have it in SSMS for sure. Yes.
That is, it's always been a pain for me, the tab management in Management Studio. Actually paging through different queries, and the notebook is a different approach to that, but solving either one of those would definitely make it easier to work.
So I'm going to repeat the first question because I forgot, my bad, and then go back to the second question. The first question was around notebooks and SSMS. I mentioned Erin is here in the audience, and so that's going to be a real good thing to do, but it's not on the immediate roadmap for SSMS. And then the second question around tab management and SSMS, I'm getting the time reminder. So that's going to be another one that I'll just go ahead and directly refer to Erin. There are shell-related improvements coming in VS 2022. Whenever we do those kinds of bumps, we get overall interface improvements, but when we look at things unique to tab management, that'll definitely be a thing. What I do want to call out is SSMS 21 previews come later this year. So if you haven't already subscribed to like the tech community blogs, we do announce these kinds of things there. So if you grab that subscription, to the Azure SQL Tech Community blogs, you'll hear about some of these previews where you may see those things sooner. I want to vacate for the next speaker and be respectful, but I'm going to hang out. Really happy to answer questions. We'll be at the booth later. Aaron is here. Subhojit is here. We're all really grateful that you all enjoyed the tools, but want to know when they're not working for you. So please feel free to come chat with us. Thank you.